My name's Martin Brunette and I'm an NHS GP, and I've been doing some short videos on my Instagram account on health anxiety. I'll put a link below to the Instagram account if you're interested. And it just made me think this is such an important topic, and I've been sort of doing something useful, I hope, but scratching the surface a bit. And I wanted to do something a bit more in depth. So I've got my cup of coffee and I thought I would just do a longer video on this channel. If you like it, please do like, please do subscribe and spread the word, because that will give me more incentive to do more of these. Health anxiety really needs a lot of special attention, because I think as anxieties, as specific types of anxiety go, it's particularly challenging. It's very common, see quite a lot of patients with it, and it's a hard one to deal with, because when you're anxious, your instinct very often is to avoid or run away from the thing that you're anxious about. Now, that's not necessarily a good strategy, but with health anxiety, in one sense, that option is completely taken away from you, because how do you avoid or run away from your own body? If your body's giving you symptoms that are making you very anxious, making you think there's something wrong, that you could be seriously ill, you can't just run away from that. So what's unique about health anxiety is how do you try and avoid those symptoms? Because generally the thing we want to avoid when we're anxious isn't really the thing that's making us anxious. It's those terrible feelings of anxiety that we get inside, the sweaty palms, the palpitations, the tremor, the feeling in your gut that something terrible's going wrong. And you want to get rid of that really unpleasant feeling. That's our instinct, to want to clear it, because it's so unpleasant. So with health anxiety, if you're worried about being ill, then the natural and obvious and instinctive way to try to deal with those anxious symptoms, those anxious feelings, is to try and reassure yourself that you're not. So reassurance-seeking behaviour becomes the prime equivalence of avoidance-seeking behaviour that you might see with other types of anxiety. So, and there are lots of different ways that you might find yourself trying to reassure yourself. So you might reassure yourself just by checking. So you've got symptoms and maybe your heart's racing a bit and you check your pulse, or maybe you've got an Apple Watch or something like that that checks your pulse and you're constantly looking at it, or maybe you check your blood pressure several times a day, or maybe you keep checking that lump in your neck so much so that you make it sore, or you've got chest pain here and you find yourself keep prodding it because you need to check whether it's anything serious or not. So you might self-check a lot, and sometimes people can self-check to a state of exhaustion because they're doing it all the time. Or you might check with other people. You might ask your friends or your relatives, what do they think? And constantly be checking with other people to say, should you be worried? Do you think it's my heart? And you might find yourself doing that repetitively, sometimes to the point where people might get frustrated with you, and then you might get frustrated with their response because they're not taking you seriously, or they're just getting cross with you. So that can happen quite a lot. You might find yourself checking online, and we'll come to that in a minute. Or you might also find yourself checking with a doctor. So you might make an appointment about things when most people wouldn't. You might find yourself making repeated appointments about the same thing. You checked and you went to see the doctor and they reassured you and you felt better, but then the symptoms were ongoing and maybe I better check again. You might go check again and again. You might also find that you're wanting the doctor to do tests to prove it's okay, because just the doctor's word, well, what if they're wrong? Doctors aren't always right. What if they're wrong? Maybe I should get a test done. You might find yourself wanting more and more tests to prove that you're okay. And most people with health anxiety are reassured by that. There are some people that have such a fixed belief they're ill that actually when doctors reassure them, it just makes them irritated because they firmly believe that doctors are just missing something. That's quite rare. Most people with health anxiety are happy to be reassured. They want to be reassured, and that reassurance gives you temporary relief. The problem is it can almost become quite addictive, where a bit like someone who's an alcoholic reaches for the whiskey bottle, and when they drink the whiskey they feel calmer, but the trouble is then they need it again. And it can become, reassurance seeking can become a bit addictive. It's just temporary, and as soon as you get more symptoms again, you reach again for the reassurance. And Google can become a real snare for you if you have health anxiety, because Google A lot of my patients say, oh, no, I shouldn't look things up on Google. Actually, I don't mind patients looking things up on Google. It can be very helpful quite often. But with health anxiety, it can be a real problem. Now, it might be really helpful for you to go and read up about health anxiety, but it's when you start Googling symptoms that you can get into trouble, because there's so much out there. And I would often say you're always 6 clicks away from cancer. In other words, within 6 clicks, if you start Googling symptoms, I think for most symptoms, you're going to find one web page somewhere that says you might have cancer. So I think there's a bit of an analogy with what happens when someone gambles. So an addicted gambler, when they gamble, sometimes they'll feel great because they win. And then sometimes they'll lose. But they know that if they keep gambling, they will always lose. Or at least we know, non-gamblers know that if you keep gambling, you're always going to lose. And it's a bit like that for people with health anxiety seeking reassurance on the internet, because sometimes you read something and you think, oh, thank goodness, that sounds okay. And you feel a little calmer. The trouble is, you might then just check one more time, a bit like the gambler just has another go. And this next time you find something that says, oh, maybe it could be serious. And then that worries you, so you have to check again, and you find something that's a bit calmer, but then you find something that says it might be even more serious. So it can be a real snare, a real danger. And I think if you've health anxiety, I would say really stay off the internet, stay off Googling symptoms. If you've been told you've got a particular health condition, go and learn about it. But Googling symptoms is a real snare for you, and you need to be really careful about that. So what about avoidance? Because avoidance can still happen for people with health anxiety. What you're more likely to do is you can't avoid the symptoms you're getting, but you might find yourself avoiding places that might cause those symptoms. So if, for instance, you tend to worry a lot about your heart, you might find that when you go to the supermarket, your heart races because you're anxious, and therefore you worry that that's going to happen at the supermarket. So the best way to stop that doing is don't go to the supermarket. So you may still be avoiding things that put you in a position that make you worry about your health. Maybe, a common type of health anxiety is a fear that you might be sick. It's called emetophobia. It's quite specific, but if you're someone who always worries that you might be sick and that might be a real problem, then you might avoid going out to places where, restaurants, going out for dinner, because you think, well, I might be sick. And that anxiety that you might be sick stops you going. So avoidance seeking is still a problem with health anxiety. Sorry, not avoidance seeking, it's reassurance seeking. Avoidance behaviour is still a problem. But it's trying to avoid situations that cause the symptoms that make you anxious in the first place. So you've got to watch out for that as well. I think with health anxiety, it's well worth trying to work out where it may have come from. So for a lot of people, health anxieties come from their own personal health experience. Maybe they had a health scare, or they had something when they were quite seriously ill for some reason, and that's made them worry that this could come back again. Maybe it's a family member who got really sick, or friends or people that you've heard of. But one way or another, this myth that we tend to grow up with, many people when they're young have this sort of myth that their body is indestructible and that nothing's going to go wrong. And eventually as we get older, we learn that that's not true forever. But that myth has been busted maybe too early or too completely for you. And now, instead of having a belief that you're indestructible, which brings its own problems, you have the opposite. You have a belief that anything could go wrong at any time. And therefore you've got to be on maximum alert for what could go wrong. It might be that you're compensating for people around you who never seem anxious about their health at all. Maybe you grew up in an environment where people really didn't go to see the doctor, and that you kind of had to overcompensate for that because no one else is worried about their health, so you've got to do the worrying for everyone about their health. And it might be that when you express your worries to people in your family, if they just dismiss it too quickly, that actually becomes quite tricky for you because they don't take health seriously in your eyes, and so therefore you must take health even more seriously, and it kind of reinforces your behaviour. I think trying to understand where it's come from might help you realise and be able to analyse some of your underlying health beliefs, which may be very much affected by this filter of worrying that everything or that something could go wrong with your body at any time. So there's often a tendency, an underlying belief that the body needs to give you symptoms as warning signs, and that if you ignore those symptoms, it's at your peril. And things like pain always indicate that there must be a problem. If your heart's racing, that must be because there's a problem. And so you very quickly go from symptom to serious disease. And some of that may be, an underlying belief. And one thing that can really reinforce that is a thing called confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is where, when we hear things or get new information, we tend to ascribe a lot more relevance and importance to information that is in agreement with our underlying beliefs, and we tend to ignore or dismiss beliefs or new information that doesn't agree with our underlying belief. And we're all subject to this, our political views or just how we see the world. But when it comes for you with health anxiety, what that will mean in practice is, if you hear a story on the news or hear about a friend who had some symptoms and turned out to be really seriously ill, or some health scare on the news, then you pay really serious attention to that, and it confirms your belief that you could get ill and you've got to watch out. Whereas if a friend says that they, had some chest pain and all was fine, then you tend to ignore that. You'll pay a lot more attention to feedback that says things can go wrong with the body. And you've got to be careful about that. There is some evidence that says that exposing yourself to news stories or Facebook groups where people have health problems, reading it about people being ill and health scares can be very harmful and very difficult for people with health anxiety, and can really reinforce it. You may well have found the COVID period particularly difficult, because there was a lot in the news to make us all scared of COVID, because the government kind of needed us to be a bit scared in order to make us wash our hands and wear masks and all of that. And you probably found yourself paying a lot of attention to that, because that would feed into a worry about our health, whereas other people seem to be more dismissive of it. You may have even been frustrated with people who seem dismissive of it because you thought they should be taking it more seriously. And there's another debate there, but it's helpful to realise that one of the reasons why you may have taken it more seriously is not because you were more at risk, but because it feeds into this underlying belief that we've got to be really careful with our health all the time. And one of the sad ironies for me with health anxiety is that sometimes, that there's this anxiety that something could go seriously wrong with your body, and therefore that could really affect your health and your life in a big way. But sometimes actual health anxiety itself is already affecting your life in a really big way, when actually you might be quite young and quite physically fit and got years of healthy living ahead of you. So, there's such anxiety that there could be something else wrong, that we're kind of missing the elephant in the room, which is that health anxiety is controlling your life. And that's the real health problem that you've got, and your life could be so improved by dealing with that. So one of the other ways I like to think about it when it comes to underlying health beliefs is what your symptom filter is like. So we all have a symptom filter, and that our body is giving us symptoms all the time, and we have to choose whether to take any note of them or not. So, for instance, I've got a slight pain in my toe at the moment, I've got a slight itch at the back of my neck. My body is giving me symptoms, and I have to decide, are they important or not? The itch could be a mosquito about to bite me, and if I was to, go and rub it, then the mosquito would fly off, and that would be helpful. On the other hand, if I spent time scratching every single little itch that ever occurred on my body, I wouldn't be able to get on with anything else, because we're getting those all the time. So our body does always give us symptoms, but that doesn't mean that they're always serious. And those symptoms tend to come with a volume control. So, a little itch with an ant crawling on my leg, that's a low volume irritation, slightly more than just a random little itch, but it's not a big deal. A wasp stinging me, that's a high volume or certainly higher volume, I'm not going to be able to ignore that. I need to pay attention to it. I put my hand on a hot stove, that's a real shout volume symptom, if you like. So our body does want to alert us to things, but it wants us to be able to ignore the low volume ones unless they're really persistent, and then we might deal with that ant on our leg, and notice the high volume ones very quickly. And what can happen when you've got health anxiety is that your filter for telling which are the high and which are the low volume symptoms is faulty. So you notice you're in a hyper aware state of noticing all these symptoms, and that can be a real problem for you because you have difficulty filtering out the low level ones. And then when you pay attention to, oh gosh, my heart, did it just beat a little bit forcefully there? You have a heightened awareness of that, and then that, by making you anxious, creates new symptoms. So when you become anxious, then your heart is going to race, you might overbreathe, that might make you a little lightheaded, might cause pins and needles in your fingers and toes because you're overbreathing. And so you get all these more symptoms, and then that becomes a bit of a feedback loop. So it's worth thinking, maybe my symptom filter is a bit broken, and that actually I shouldn't respond to every symptom my body is giving me. And I need to recalibrate that. And then, one question is, well, how do we do that? And your natural tendency when you've got health anxiety and you've got symptoms is to always try and prove whether the symptoms are serious or not. But one of the best and most helpful ways of treating health anxiety is what's called psychoeducation. It's educating you about what's going on. And so rather than trying to understand why that tummy pain isn't bowel cancer, it's often better to understand why someone who's anxious might get tummy pain, or why someone gets tummy pain with irritable bowel syndrome, for instance. Because if all the time you're trying to prove it's not serious, all you need is a slight change in the symptoms, and then you can think, oh, maybe this could be serious. Whereas if you try to understand what the body is doing and why sometimes, we get tummy cramps or we get palpitations, or, sometimes actually it's perfectly normal to be able to feel glands in your neck. We've got 40 of them plus in our neck. It's quite normal for them sometimes to be a bit raised. Once you understand that can be more helpful, that then you can go, okay, I know my heart feels a little bit stronger at the moment, but it's going at a normal rate, and that's normal and what I would expect, particularly because I'm a little anxious at the moment. So you're understanding the cause of the symptoms as opposed to constantly trying to prove that they're not your heart, for instance, or not cancer. The other thing that can be quite helpful is actually doing physical activities that replicate the symptoms, but in a way that you can understand. So that, again, there's good evidence for this. So for instance, if you worry about your heart, and whenever your heart races, it makes you assume that you must be having a problem with your heart. You wouldn't be surprised if your heart raced if you went for a brisk walk or if you went for a run. So if you do exercise, you expect your heart to race. It's when your heart races, when you're just sitting doing nothing, that you get very worried and get very anxious. So what can then be helpful is to go and get used to your heart racing in a normal situation where you'd expect it to race. So exercise can be really helpful. My heart raced, well, of course it did, I was going on a run. And then I've got used to my heart racing. So when it sometimes races at other times, it doesn't seem so alien. Whereas if you've been avoiding going exercising because you have this belief that somehow your actually quite young, healthy heart mustn't be strained because that could be dangerous, then you've not got used to your heart racing. So when it does race, it seems alarming. So putting yourself in a position where in an unexpected way you experience some of the symptoms. This is particularly useful if palpitations, your heart racing, or feeling breathless is part of the problem. Actually going and doing exercise when you get those symptoms can be tremendously helpful. I think the other thing that can be really helpful is just saying to yourself, I am affected by health anxiety and I need to get some help for this. What can often happen when it comes to seeing doctors is that most of your contact with a doctor may well be when you've got physical symptoms, you are anxious, but your priority in your mind is to prove these physical symptoms are not due to serious physical disease like cancer or a heart problem, for instance. And so the attention of the consultation is on the physical symptoms. The doctor needs to spend most of the time checking that, yeah, we don't need to worry about this, and explaining to you why you don't need to worry about it. And if they at that point start saying, I think you have a bit of health anxiety, sometimes that can be helpful, but you're not always in the right frame of mind for that. And you might just see that as dismissing your physical symptoms, and you want to just really check the physical symptoms. That's what you're there for. So dealing with your health anxiety can often get pushed to the side, even if you've seen your doctor lots of times. And what can be really helpful is to go to see your doctor, not to talk about physical symptoms, and actually really try hard not to. You'll find that difficult because you'll kind of want to do a, while I'm here, doctor, are you sure these palpitations are not my heart? But as far as possible, try and avoid doing any of that and say, look, I know I get health anxiety and I'm ready to do something about it now. What can I do to help? And you focus on the health anxiety. Now, one of the most useful things would be cognitive behavioural therapy. This is where we look at thoughts, feelings and behaviours and how they affect how our physical body is. So how our thoughts can affect what our physical body is doing, how we feel can affect our physical body, what we do can affect it, both for better and for worse. And that's where, for instance, a thought that, or a belief that if you stress your heart, that's bad news for you, can be challenged. And you can understand that actually that's not the case. You might then go and do a behaviour and action where you go for a run, and you find that actually your heart races, but that feels okay. And you don't feel as anxious the last time your heart raced because you understood why it was happening. Therefore, you start to think, well, maybe my heart's not so bad after all. Therefore, you might be able to act again and go for a run. And then the next time you feel anxious and your heart races at home, you might feel less stressed by it because your thoughts have changed. And therefore, you're more able to go and do the things that make you anxious. So these things can spiral in a way that makes you close down, avoid things, seek reassurance, and not tackle the underlying health anxiety. But a proper understanding of them, usually with the help of a therapist, because it's not that simple, can really help you to spiral in a positive way. Instead of a vicious cycle, it becomes a virtuous cycle. And then as things improve, you start being able to do more and more. You start being able to experience symptoms without catastrophizing and thinking that something terrible must be going on, and your life expands. It will be hard work. It's like an athlete who's injured and out of condition, and retraining and getting your physical body fit again when you've been out of condition is hard work. And it's the same mentally. It would be, it'll probably involve homework. It'll probably involve saying, okay, I'm going to practice going to the supermarket because I've been avoiding that for some time. Or I'm going to practice going out running. Or I'm going to practice not going on Google. Or I'm going to limit the amount that I'm allowed to reassure myself. A number of times I'm allowed to ask someone for reassurance. You'll set goals with your therapist and get used to behaving and acting in a different way and challenging some of your underlying health beliefs. And that, if you're open-minded about that, that can be tremendously helpful. But, there's also a role for medication for some people, not for everyone, but sometimes health anxiety is part of generalized anxiety disorder. And some of the unhelpfully named antidepressants, I wish antidepressants had a better name because we often use them for anxiety. People are not depressed, and it can be quite disconcerting to be told you put on an antidepressant when you don't feel depressed. But some of the similar medications, they're called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, but that's a bit hard to trip off the tongue. Some of those can be helpful in bringing down your overall level of anxiety, and then that can make it easier to deal with because, it's all very well saying, go and face some of your anxiety, stop avoiding things. But if you're terrified of that, it can be quite hard. And sometimes alongside therapy, or in order to bring down your overall level of anxiety before therapy, medication can be helpful. What's much less helpful is a tablet to take when you're anxious. There aren't great tablets for that, they tend to be addictive. And largely what you really want is when you're anxious to learn the skills to bring your anxiety levels down rather than be dependent on taking a tablet any more than you'd want to be dependent on, having a couple of whiskies to calm down.